All right, everybody, welcome to Dharma Live Online. It's good to be with you here in the new year. So things kind of worked out good last week I spoke a little bit about right concentration as the eighth path factor. Um, and so now I'm going to begin probably quite a series of talks. I think at the beginning of the year, it's nice I'm going to talk for probably many weeks on meditation practice itself, meditation practice, meditation instruction, meditation theory. I think that these ideas aren't spoken about enough, and I find it to be very helpful. I'm sort of a stickler. I sort of pride myself on being a good meditation instructor, and I've been trained by some very great people over the years. And also as a practitioner, I, you know, I've really struggled with meditation instructions. I feel like I've gotten bad instructions and bad theory over the years, and been asked to do things that were quite complicated. So I think meditation is again. Let's not think about this. Meditation is not about mastering some technique to achieve some outcome. Okay, it's more than that. That's part of it. There is an element of we do have to learn how to work with our minds and our cognition and certain common mental factors, things like attention. We have to deal with the reality of attention usually right out of the gate. So there is an element to technique that is valuable, but at some point we want to really be able to drop the technique and sort of practice. The analogy that I, as a musician, one of the things that I say is like I play guitar, and to learn how to play guitar, you have to be able to learn some technique. You have to be able to shape the chords, and you have to be able to do some single note stuff. You need to learn some stuff, but what you want to be able to do is play. And so we want to have just enough of technique under our belt in meditation practice so that we can actually sit and, for lack of a better word, play. And that, what I mean by that is working with our experience as it arises in present time in a way that we feel some degree of, dare I say, confidence, and some degree of, we have kind of a sense of what we're attempting to do here. And so when you get a little confidence under your belt and you get a little sense of you, when you sit down and close your eyes, you kind of have a sense of what to do. That's really where your practice begins to take off. Because I know this for sure, being around the country and teaching as many places as I have, the big issue, I think, in mindfulness culture is people are plagued with this really horrible idea that they're not doing it correctly. I'm not doing it right. And that's a big obstacle and a big hindrance. And we want to deal with that really kind of as quickly and as efficiently as possible, because that will really bum you out, and it'll get you to the point where you just kind of stop. So let's talk about this very troubling word in English, concentration. So and there's varying degrees of theories on this. I think that certainly the mindfulness world and the insight teachers, I think generally speaking, teachers tend to overemphasize the role of concentration within the cultivation of the practice. I think that people tend to think it's more important than I actually believe that it is. So, and I've struggled with it over the years. So there's two terms that we get. We get this word concentration. So where did this word concentration come? The two words in Pali are samatha and samadhi. Samatha practice is usually about, and this isn't actually correct. This is actually a mistranslation. This is just meditation teachers dropping the ball, frankly. Is that a lot of times they think about samatha as about one pointedness. I take my attention and I put it on one object and I hold it there. For example, I put my attention on breathing, and that's the only object I pay attention to, and I try to keep all the other objects at bay. That's not really samatha. That's just a one-pointed practice that may or may not have benefits for the first-person user, for the meditator. Samatha actually means calm, abiding. So Buddhist concentration, let's call it that, is about relaxation or calming the mind. Now, when I think of the English word concentration, I do not think of relaxation or calmness as a synonym whatsoever. I would not put those two words together. So in early Buddhist thought, what the Buddha is saying, or what the meditation theory is that to practice with the mind experience. We have to calm it down to some degree. We have to cool it down. And there's multiple ways of doing that. So samatha is about calming the mental activities. And there's multiple ways to do that, not just about concentrating on a single object. The other term that I spoke about last week is this other term, samadhi, which usually is translated as concentration, which is a very inaccurate translation. I think it's a poor translation, and I think we need to dump it. Samadhi means more like collectedness of mind, unification of mind, or really, I think the best term is the mind is integrated. And so that means that from the foundations of mindfulness, it means in the present moment experience, I'm aware of my body, I'm aware of feelings, I'm aware of the mental states, I'm aware of the mental activities. With samadhi, I'm probably vaguely aware of a whole range of experiences, but I'm not jumping out into any one of them in particular. I'm integrated, I'm whole, I'm together. And that's actually, I think, samadhi is the term that I would put more weight and importance on the term samadhi than samatha. And it's also the eighth path factor. So it's also the integration of these, of all the path factors, of the views and the intentions and the words and the actions. And it's a really great experience, actually. So samadhi, when you do retreats, you can get in these samadhi states, and it's really quite enjoyable. So these words as concentration is problematic. And so, uh, and also, let's just be clear about this: is that before the Buddha, whatever happened to him, before he woke up, before his awakening, let's call it, he went around. We know the story. He was on this kind of existential quest. He was a seeker. He was a searcher. He was trying to come to terms with the existential angst of being a human. He was trying to come to terms with suffering. He was trying to, and he realized that all the religious traditions and all the things that were offered to him in the culture of his time, he rejected all of those and said, that's not what I'm looking for. Probably a lot of us feel that way right now, you know? And so he went and sat with the great meditation masters of his time, and he learned their techniques, and he rejected them all. He said, this is not what I'm looking for. And one of the things that he rejected was concentration. And this idea, and this is a big problem, I think, this idea that we get is that we're going to concentrate the mind on a particular object. We're going to get so concentrated that we're going to have some kind of breakthrough and have access to some other psychological experience, enlightenment, let's call it. And that we think, and a lot of us think this way. I know I did for years. And I think that there's a setup by Buddhism where we're going to meditate and we're going to practice and we're going to do this thing, whatever this thing is. And at some point in the journey, there's going to be an event. There's going to be some event. And on the other side of that event, my life is going to be easy. I'm going to be enlightened. I'm going to have wisdom. I'm going to have access to something that I don't have access to now, which is going to kind of make everything okay or better or easy. You're probably familiar with this idea. And this is a bad idea. You need to smash this idea out of your head because it's not what he's talking about at all. It's actually the religion of ancient India. So the idea is that you concentrate the mind, and this is really Brahmanism, and that is the Atman, the self, and Brahman, which is kind of Brahman is sort of the universe or God, whatever their version of God is. And the goal is to unite Atman and Brahman. So basically, what they're saying is that the goal is to become one with the universe, to not be born again in this human body, and then you enter some kind of universal experience of bliss or whatever. And that was the kind of goal of ancient Indian, or what they would call the soteriological goal of ancient India. Soteriology is the study of salvation from an academic perspective. And so a lot of Buddhism that we know about it today is still ascribing to this idea, forgetting that the Buddha actually rejected all of that and said, this is not what I'm looking for. I want to come to terms with the reality of birth, old age, sickness, and death. And so the way that the Buddha woke up was mindfulness, not concentration, mindfulness, awareness, being able to be in touch with the flow of events moment to moment, having some insight into how the mind operates and where we have agency and where we don't have agency, and the things in our mind and our experience that we want to overcome and abandon, and the things that we want to cultivate. Essentially, this whole Dharma thing, which is, not a light topic, as I'm sure you're all aware. So when we think about So then the question becomes, well, how much concentration does it take to develop mindfulness? And that's a big question that I think you could ask 100 different teachers and get 100 different answers. And some teachers really, really think that concentration is essential, and without some degree of concentration, mindfulness is not possible. Um, I don't think that way at all. I don't actually believe, nor do I think that you need all that much concentration to actually experience and practice mindfulness. I just don't think you need that much. Um, in fact, concentration, and I've been here and I've done this a lot of times, and a lot of meditators who do this, there's a term you're probably familiar with called spiritual bypass. And what can happen in a spiritual bypass is some meditators, some people, not me, because I have PTSD, and I'll talk about the role of PTSD here, is that they'll use concentration. They'll become so absorbed in an object such as the breathing that they can use this focused attention to actually repress emotion or repress experiences that we want to avoid. And then you can start using like a vipassana or mindfulness technique as a way to bypass or to avoid aspects of your experience that you should actually be open to and that you should be experiencing. This is largely true with emotion. If you become good, if you become a good concentrator and you become skilled and really good Buddhist style attentional training, you can use that to avoid all kinds of unpleasant feelings. And as you probably know, repressed emotions and suppressed emotions come with a whole range of side effects that will have destructive outcomes on your life and in particularly your relationship with other people. So we don't want to do that. Now, and this happened to me, I'll tell you, this was my entire retreat experience in the 90s. And I was sitting at IMS in my early 20s. I was sitting a 10-day Vipassana retreat for almost 10 years every summer. And it was back in the 90s. The primary methodology was a kind of, uh, it was very Burmese heavy, very Sayadaw U Pandita kind of Mahasi methodology, where there was a kind of overemphasizing of being able to hold the attention on a single object. That was I think that was overly emphasized. There was other things they were doing that made it easier for me, like noting, which we'll get to at some point. But that overemphasizing it. So what happens to people, this isn't true for everybody, but if you have any PTSD in your system, and I had a fucking boatload of PTSD in my system in the 90s, let me tell you, which I poured copious amounts of alcohol on to bring it down to a reasonable volume. But they don't serve alcohol in these Buddhist meditation retreats, so I had to go without. So, what happens, and we know that this is neuroscience, and this is well documented, is that if you have symptoms of PTSD, which probably means that you have the experience of hypervigilance. And so hypervigilance is a kind of hyperactive attention that kind of clocks moment to moment experience like really a little bit too hard. Like you're really, you're because of safety, you're just kind of really like, and it's kind of a mindfulness in a way, but it's a very kind of uh, not calm mindfulness. Okay, a very kind of the cat waiting to pounce on the mouse that's about to come around the corner. Very actually exhausting experience. Now, if you're learning concentration with any PTSD or hypervigilance, that when you overforce attention, so I'm trying to pay attention to my breathing and I'm finding that I'm not able to do that. So and my mind's wandering and I'm getting irritated because I'm unable to do the technique and I'm getting frustrated. And then what I'm doing is I'm striving. I'm actually trying to nail the present moment to the goddamn floor. Okay? And what happens is when you overforce attention, it kicks on the amygdala and it actually triggers fight and flight. So if you're trying to do concentration practices and you're finding that it's challenging, and then you're just kind of pushing too hard, your fight and flight response is going to kick on. You're going to get triggered, and then now you're in a PTSD state, and you're sitting quietly in a hall of 100 people at this meditation retreat where you're supposed to be calming the mind, like ready to rip people's fucking heads off because you're just switching on these traumatic stress states. Of course, I didn't know this, and this research is actually relatively recent. So what I had to do, and I had good teachers, thank God, at the time. Steve Armstrong, in particular, Stephen Smith, who emphasized metta, which I talk about that a lot. So he said, well, don't worry about being on the breath, and don't worry about this attention. Just see if you can like be a little bit more kind with yourself and a little bit more kind with your experience. And I was able to do that in a way that I was like, okay, well, I can do that. I can do that. That's harder, but it was easier than the attention, concentration, focus game. The other thing I learned, which we'll talk about in weeks to come, is um, a very specific technique in the Burmese lineage, particularly the Mahasi Sayadaw, which is really just noting. So what happens is, what you do in noting is that you're watching the breathing. You're with the mindfulness of breathing to some degree. You're not trying to pipple lockjaw it. You're just generally watching it, and you're realizing that there's these distractor objects, what they would call in Mahasi theory secondary objects. So the primary object of my focus would be my breathing, and I'm knowing that there's secondary objects arising in my mind body system that are kind of tugging at my attention. So instead of trying to resist those objects and bite down harder on the breath, what I do is I open to those, and I note them. I name them. I say sound, or I say thought, or maybe I get specific and I say, well, I'm just planning, or I'm remembering. So what I'm doing is I'm not trying to lock down so much on the primary object. I'm realizing other things are arising, but I'm actually noticing what they are with mindfulness. And I'm saying, well, that's a sound, that's a thought, that's a memory, that might be fear. And what it does is it allows me to have a more liberal attention, where I'm letting myself be aware of things, multiplicity of things. And ironically, for me, that would actually help me become more concentrated. I'd get more focused in that way. The other theory, of course, that they didn't know about at the time, but like if you look at some of the techniques to deal with traumatic stress, is there's something called three-pointed attention. And if you attempt to be aware of three particular objects, the mind, it takes a certain amount of cognitive energy that you won't become bogged down with thought. So for example, I might notice, for me, I typically would use breathing in the body, and I would use sound if sound is available. And then I might use like temperature in my body. So I'll be like, I'm warm, I'm breathing, I hear the sound of the bird, I'm warm. So what I'm doing is I'm having a more liberal attitude about. I'm letting the attention walk around a little bit, but really what I'm doing is I'm cultivating mindfulness. Is I'm letting the attention walk around a little bit, but I'm letting myself know where the attention is going, and that's really what creates the experience of samadhi, or collectedness, or unification, because I'm bringing things together. Now, I'm not really concerned with a particular object. I'm not trying or attempting to just stay with one thing. I'm generally aware of, there's a number of things going on, and I'm aware of those. One of the things that's going on that I'm aware of is that I'm tending to get lost in thinking much of the time. And then that goes on, and then I notice, well, that happened, and then I come back. So that is kind of a more, I would say, a trauma informed way to think about mindfulness that you might find to be more valuable. Now, the thing about this, and this is why working with a teacher or being in a group like this can be helpful, is that, let's be honest, we are all very different. Some people, largely I think people who don't have PTSD, because I've had many conversations, people who don't have this kind of hyper vigilant, this kind of radioactive attention, they're able to do just pay attention to the breathing, and they calm right down, and they're able to practice, and they actually probably have no idea what I'm talking about right now. They don't have that experience. And so if you're one of those people who finds that paying attention to the breath alone calms you down and brings you into the mind body system with ease, and then great. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think we have to, for ourselves, we all have to practice a range of techniques and a range of practices, and discern for ourselves which ones are conducive to the way our system is organized. And that actually takes some time. And it takes a willingness, and it also takes and some of you are probably good at this, but if you're offered a meditation technique and it doesn't really work and you've dedicated some time to it, then you can just chuck it, and so uh, don't make yourself try to do things that just don't seem to work, because if you look at, if you look within the canon and in the cosmos of Buddhist meditation, there's just, I don't know, there's probably thousands of practices. So find the ones that work, and go with those and kind of roll those out. So even when you think about like when I say mindfulness of breathing, um, notice I'm saying mindfulness of breathing. I'm not saying concentration on the breath. Some people will say concentration on the breath, but I'm saying mindfulness of breathing, and that means I'm choosing to, or I'm at least attempting to allow the predominant experience, my awareness. I'm saying, okay, I'm going to try to be more aware of the breath than anything else, but I'm also going to let myself recognize and realize there's other things happening, and that's okay. And I can be with breathing, and I can recognize there's other things going on, and I'm not trying to reject. I'm not trying to build this kind of concrete wall where the only thing that's happening is the breathing and all the other distractions go away. Now, if this resonates with you, if you find that you have some hyperactive attention, the way that I'm talking about it is you're going to have a steeper learning curve. It's going to take you a little bit longer, because you're going to have to deal with the downside of this. The downside of not being able to just focus on one object is you're going to find that you're going to be lost in mind wandering probably a bit more. So this is why metta is so important, is we also have to make sure that we do not start thinking or believing that mind wandering is somehow bad or wrong or a problem. Getting lost in thought is part of the practice. It's not, and it doesn't stand in opposition to the practice. It's just it's part of the deal, man. The mind thinks, and the mind proliferates, and the mind fantasizes, and the mind judges, and the mind, let's be honest, the mind is a time machine. The mind is an elaborate, sophisticated time machine that will go back. In one moment, it'll be back 15 years, rehashing out some resentment that you're pissed off about some person. And then 2 seconds later, you're planning on where you're going to have your vacation next summer. It's all over the goddamn place. And that's not your fault. That's just kind of the experience of mind. That's kind of the stuff that we're up against. So we want to recognize that and accept that to some degree as soon as possible, and also just kind of see if we can develop a relationship with that reality that's more metta, that's more like, it's okay that happens, trying to be friendly with that. So that way, we try to manage the amount of irritation or disappointment that we experience when we're practicing, about like, we're trying to practice and our general assessment is like, I'm just not really good at this, and this is like too hard. And then that becomes a space that happens a lot, and we gotta tackle that, I think, relatively quickly. So we'll do a mindfulness of breathing practice, and I'll kind of give it more of a global view. But just to say this, also what we'll look at in the next couple of weeks is essentially, as much as within the various schools of Buddhist thought, all the way from the Theravada to the Mahayana, the Zen, and the 7 schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and even some of the Japanese Buddhism, New Land Buddhism, and so forth. Lots of stuff. Within all of those systems, there is, I don't know, probably thousands of different kinds of meditations. But we have to realize all Buddhist meditation that we learn, they all fit in one of 3 kind of categories. So essentially, there's only really 3. And the first one is what I've been talking about. There is what we would call, I don't like this term, but we're getting stuck with it, concentration practices. Or I would say more specifically, there are practices specifically designed to train attention. So concentration, probably the better way to say it, is focused attention. Is that we do want to be able to some degree train our attention to be, not to be concentrated, but to be non-distracted, or at least being able to resist the tug of that. And that's attention training, and that's valuable, but that's not the end of the story. And many people just do that. So we developed this focused attention practices, which we call concentration practices, and then there's mindfulness practices, or we could call them awareness practices. There's practices where we specifically cultivate a kind of mind that can monitor experience, that is aware of the multiplicity of things. That's metacognition. And there's quite a few mindfulness practices, but they all fit in that cultivation of awareness. And lastly, and of course, there's what we call heart practices, which is loving kindness, metta, compassion, gratitude, and equanimity. And so we try to train. Those are really more, in a very specific way. Those are the relational mindfulness practices. There's not what is arising in my experience. So in mindfulness, we learn to discern and we learn to recognize things that are coming up and being able to be clear about what this is. And then at the same time, we all want to be able to assess and to feel into what is my relationship with what's arising in my experience. And these all support each other. The stronger your ability to focus attention, the stronger your ability will be to cultivate mindfulness. The more mindfulness that you have, the more able to relate to that in a different way. And we'll talk about these in weeks to come. We'll go through all three of these doing concentration tonight. So when you sit, when I work with people one-on-one, I generally say you should be doing, in the course of a week, you should do at least one of these. So maybe one day I'll do a mindfulness of breathing practice, then maybe I'll do an open awareness practice, and then maybe I'll do some metta. I'll go back to some mindfulness of breathing. I'll go to a different mindfulness practice, then I'll do some compassion or gratitude, because you want to be able to get a sense of the kind of repertoire of realizing that there's different languages. So there's a felt sense of, like, when I do mindfulness of breathing, I know what mindfulness of breathing sort of feels like, because I've done it for thousands of hours. I know what metta feels like. I get a sense of that. And that's really where we start to gain confidence. And I think the most efficient way to develop confidence is to have a practice where you're rotating these three practices on a weekly basis and you're getting a sense of what they are. It's more dynamic. It's, dare I say, more fun, because you're developing different kinds of ways of practicing. And you will find that if you practice in this way, you will make progress much quicker, because you're seeing there's a progression, and that all of these practice ideas, they're all interrelated. But I meet people, that I work with, that I travel around the country, people who are like, yeah, I'm doing mindfulness of breathing for 20 years. And it's like, okay, well, nothing wrong with that. But they people get to a point where they feel stuck. They're like, I don't even know what the hell and I've been there many times where for periods when I'd sit down and be like, I don't even know what the fuck I'm supposed to be doing, you know? And so we want to make sure that when we sit for, whether we sit for 20 or 30 minutes, that we're clear about what we're going to do. I'm going to do mindful. I make a decision. I sit in the cushion over there in the corner. I say, I'm going to do mindfulness of breathing today. And then that's just what I do. Or I'm going to do metta, and that's just what I do. I don't get into this problem that I've been in before, what I call Dharma channel surfing, where people will sit, they do mindfulness of breathing, then they do some metta, maybe do some forgiveness. They're switching these different practices as a kind of way to kind of entertain yourself, which is, I've done that, and it's a really, really kind of bad habit. It's a very bad habit to develop. So whatever you're going to do, and this is why, like, this courses, I have courses, you can, this is where guided meditation can be really, really good. It's like, okay, I want to learn how to do an appreciative joy practice. We'll find a guided meditation and do it until you get a sense of it. So there's a lot of resources out there that can support us in that. So what I'll do is I'm going to teach kind of the most preliminary mindfulness practice that I do, which is kind of what I would call, uh, again, I don't like this word concentration, but it would fit in the attention training camp. Let's just say concentration, by being mindfulness of breathing, but in a more liberal sense, where you're mindful of breathing, but you're also aware and cognizant of other things happening. You're not resisting everything else, but you're attempting to allow the predominant experience to be breathing. And when I say mindfulness of breathing, I mean mindfulness of the breathing body. So it's not just breathing, it's the breathing body. And so however you experience that is fine. And I'll use sound and temperature. I'll use some other things so you can kind of get a sense, so you're not trying to just lock things down on one specific um, object or experience. So you can allow yourself to just kind of find a comfortable way to sit.